to be here. I'm going to get started. I won't do my introduction. I did that last week, and there's information on my bio with some of the um, sign-up information that you had. But I do want to start with a hand raise, and that is I'm just wondering how many. It looks like we've got 23 folks signed up now. How many of you attended last week? So if you could just click that hand raise, I'll have Corbin keep an eye on that, and he can let me know. So it's looking good so far, so that's great. I appreciate the fact that you've made time for both. Okay, so hey, Corbin, I'm seeing a message box on my screen at file 8. I don't know if you can minimize. Yep, there we go. Thank you. So this is a slide that you saw last week, but I put it up again as kind of a placeholder, if you will. Last week we covered the preparing to teach, task design, task analysis, kind of that content area. This week the focus is going to be on teaching, talking about delivering assistance, teaching to cues, error correction, fading. So we're moving into that. It occurred to me though, I don't know if I explained that slide last week, and some people say, "What? I don't even understand why you would put that slide up." So in describing it, it's a picture of a house that's badly in need of paint. In my mind, the analogy is, let's go back to the house needing paint. Many of you probably have been involved in a decision about whether or not to paint at this point or to do prep at this point. And what we know is that there's pros and cons. If we go ahead and just slap the paint on because it's going to look good from the road, it's going to look great for the next week or maybe year, we might make that decision. But others of us know that when we've done that, typically we end up, there's a lot of waste involved. We wasted time in buying paint. We've wasted time in painting. Ultimately, if we stay in that house, we're going to have to go back and remove all that and do it the right way. So I think the same in my mind is true in terms of getting into teaching. There can be a tendency to just jump in and let's start teaching right away versus taking the time. However, and some people say, well, how much time? It's really how much, whatever time is needed in order to understand who we're going to be working with, where we're going to be working, what is the job, how is the job done. Having that information before you move into teaching many times will contribute to your teaching be a lot more effective versus just jumping in to teach. So that's the reason for that picture. So a few kind of slides before we get into the actual teaching strategies. Something that I try to keep in mind is how it feels to be or how it felt to be the learner in a situation where it's something you don't know how to do. There's some pressure, some expectation that you learn how to do it, and just trying to get some of that feeling back as we work with each individual. The thing is, in a systematic instruction situation, typically we know now what the task is, we know how to do it, we know what the expectations are. Maybe we're excited about this opportunity for the learner, keeping in mind that the learner is not in that same place. They don't have the same information about the task. There's some pressure, expectation that they learn. And so what I have people go back to is try to think of a time, either in your recent past or further back, when you've been in a situation where you haven't known how to do something. You were having to rely on a teacher, an instructor, someone to teach you how to do it. What are the things that worked in that situation? And this is a time that as we're kind of talking, if you can think in one or two words, enter into the chat box, what are the things that work for you or have worked when you're in a situation where the pressure is on for you to learn something and you don't know? The picture there, I don't know how many of you went through the process of learning to drive a stick, but that's a picture that when I came across it, I thought this is perfect, because for those of us who've had that experience, we're back there maybe it was 40 years ago, but we're immediately back there when we think about that experience. Um, so I see people are ruling in hands-on demonstrations, seeing the whole process, having a written list. So it's someone who's responding to your need for that in order to learn effectively. Some people say, if whoever is teaching me is calm, they're encouraging. If they're ready to step in with help when it seems like I need it. Another huge one, and think back to this, situations where there's been an expectation that you could learn it. And that's, if that is not present, we can think back to times when perhaps we're in a situation where the person doing the teaching or helping didn't really think we could get it. So a lack of expectation. So those are just things that I always try to keep in mind when I'm jumping into any teaching situation, whether it's someone with an intellectual disability or a coworker, or a family member, just realizing that for some people, it's anxiety provoking. The research points, and the top two is research done not around folks with intellectual disability, but just learners in general. The two biggest blocks to learning have to do with anxiety produced either by the teacher or anxiety produced by the fear of failure. So if you can think back to maybe those learning experiences that weren't so great, where there was a lot of anxiety in just the process of learning and going into that situation, what we know about anxiety is it tends to shut down the areas of the brain that we need for learning. And it just kind of goes into this survival mode. Another way I think about this is that any learner who's experiencing a lot of anxiety, that's typically not a teaching moment. It's not a time when people do well and are able to take in information. So I always keep that in mind for myself. If I become anxious in teaching, or if I believe my learners becoming anxious, that's a real clear indicator for me that I need to respond to that. And how you respond to it is going to depend on your learner, but the bottom line is recognizing it and addressing it, because it doesn't do much to support learning when people start getting anxious. Dave Hingsberger is someone that has been in our field for many, many years, and he talks about, especially with intellectual folks who have intellectual developmental disabilities, that oftentimes the causes of anxiety are failed attempts to learn, where I've done this before, I've tried, I haven't done well. And in some cases, connected to that is a history of whoever was doing the teaching as being someone who had authority, was powerful, and perhaps controlling. So recognizing that not all, but some of the learners that we're working with have issues around anxiety related to learning. Another thing I think about as I'm going into teaching with someone is, what's their motivation to learn? Okay. What we know is that there are certainly some external motivators that exist in jobs that are ongoing. A paycheck, I get to be part of a team, I have benefits, vacation. Those are within the paid jobs that we develop for the most part. And yet, some of you may have folks who are working but not necessarily making a connection to getting paid. So it's obviously not the paycheck for some people, which is kind of interesting. Or maybe some people who prefer not to take vacation. That's not an incentive. They actually don't want to take vacation. They want to keep working. So recognizing that even some of those external motivators aren't going to be incentives for some workers. Other external motivators can be added by other people. High fives, praise, added incentives, awards. All of these things exist in many workplaces outside of supported employment. And yet, if you think back to Stuart doing that binding post, when I really had a chance to watch that video, and I worked with him on some other tasks, what I recognized is that what seemed to be most rewarding to him and create the most motivation was actually just being able to get through the task, to complete the task, and be able to go on to the next task or the next cycle of a task. So And then for other people, external motivators can be self-managed, checklists, charts. For some people, it's just being able to check an item off a list that brings them to the next point on the list. So lots of, whoops, sorry, I'm going to have to silence my security system. It's a sunny day in Seattle, so lots of people are walking in my neighborhood. And the dog seems to think it's her job to keep them all in line. At any rate, so here's a question. What percent of people that you have known in the past, supported in work in the past, or maybe you're currently supporting, what percent of those individuals do you believe are motivated by just what's external in the task, what's already there, paychecks, high fives, praise, checklists? If you were to think back, what percentage of the folks you've known are motivated by those, some or all of those things? So I'm going to have Corbin kind of keep an eye on that if people do put percentages in. What I find when I ask that question of audiences is that there are some folks who say, actually, when I think about it, probably 95 to 100% of my caseload, people I've known or currently working with, really, I don't have to think about incentives or motivation. Some people say 70, some people say 20. Really, there's no right answer. There's no correct answer. But what I will say is that if you're supporting people that fall into that range of saying, I'm not really sure what the incentive is, what the motivation is. I'm not even sure if they want a job or want to be here. And therefore, I'm not really sure how I can encourage them to focus on this task or work more quickly on this task. If you're working with that segment of the population, it's incumbent upon us to then try to figure out what we can either build in, what we may need to build in and gradually fade, but it's kind of coming to that realization that for some people, systematic instruction is helpful if they have issues in learning tasks. If the issue is whether or not they even want to learn, care about learning, want to be there, then systematic instruction is by itself is not going to be the tool. If someone, I have pretty good skills in teaching, and I'm always trying to get better with that. But if I'm working with someone who really doesn't give a rip about being there or doesn't see a reason for being there, then my teaching skills are not going to be as effective. That's the reality. I see we've got 80%, 90%, 80, 90. That's great because it means that you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about that. So this is just a slide situation where I went in, a little bit of backstory on that, having to do with motivation and incentive to the work. The task itself was rolling silverware at a restaurant. Some of you may have folks that are doing that job or that job combined with other jobs in a restaurant. This particular individual was working 3 days a week, 2 hours a day, had been in the position for a year, 12, 14 months, a fair period of time. The accuracy was exceptional. Every single unit was wrapped perfectly. There were no errors. The accuracy was perfect. Quality was perfect. The issue was this person was working at about maybe 20% of what other individuals in the restaurant would have been doing in terms of rolling silverware, making the same wage. So making full wage, working at about 20% of the expected level of productivity. So in kind of observing this and asking questions, I was the outside eyes. There was a job coach that had been there throughout this period, 3 days a week, 2 hours a day, every week, every month. The question I had was, so, what about going faster? Are there concerns? And the job coach said, well, I really don't think he can go faster. And the other thing is that no one's saying anything. So I actually think it's fine. No one's raising any objections. I don't think he can go faster. And I just went, whoa. a lot of concerns about that. I think one of the bigger issues had to do with the expectations that the job coach had, in that she'd been told, you are to be with this person during their shift, that's your job. And so there had been no expectation for her to fade. At any rate, kind of looked at a number of areas in the job or within that task, but specifically, he was told verbally by the job coach, you really should go faster, you need to go faster. And he typically would, he could hear, he would look at her and sort of nod yes and go back and just be rolling at the same rate. So I said, let's see if we can. I think maybe part of what's happening is that, number one, there's not a particular incentive for him to go faster right now. His paycheck goes to his mom. He has pretty much anything he ever wants or needs. He gets his fries and Coke at the end of every shift, right up until when he gets fired. So his life, there's no real consequences that you could add, or incentives that you could add. But I said, let's see if maybe the issue is he doesn't understand how fast he really needs to go. And so what you're looking at now is, and I didn't draft this up on a computer to work with this gentleman. I typically keep graph paper, colored pens, that sort of thing with me. And I said, let's see if we can make faster visual. So number one, we gave him a way where he could count his own work, because what was happening was he would do his units, push them across the table to the job coach. He would count them, record them, and then put them away for use. So we gave him a method where he could count his own work with simply hitting a clicker. We discovered that, in fact, even though he may not have a sense of numbers, he could look at a number and record a number. So he was recording his own number of units produced. He then, at the end of each shift, we kind of had this expectation of where he needed to get at the end of his shift. And this was still not where he needed to be, but it was sort of let's set a short-term objective. He was rolling under 30 units in a 2-hour period. I said, I think physically, I don't see any reason why he can't get to at least 60 short-term. And then at the end of every shift, he got to take the number of units he did, and he was the one that got to draw the line on the grid, the graph paper, up to where he'd reached that day. So this was only 5 days, and you can see that, and that was the only difference. Nothing else was changed. He simply had more skin in the game, I guess, if you will. He got to record the units. He got to draw the line in, and it's like, that's it. At least that's the answer for this for right now, is that that's his incentive. And the other thing is that he could see where he needed to go. What does faster really look like? So that's just one example of, kind of landing on the right motivation for this fellow. In stepping back from that, I think these kind of opportunities, when we can go in and sometimes look at current performance, what I saw was that, number one, he was over-supported in just about every part of his job. The job coach had built her in to performing that, and also underemployed. Here was a young man, lots of endurance and stamina, very capable, but was kind of locked into 6 hours a week because the belief was that the job coach felt she couldn't fade. So there's that capacity issue. A lack of expectation for his independence, and therefore the job coach had about 6 hours a week that she could spend with this fellow, and felt like she couldn't possibly increase his hours because she felt she needed to be there at all times. So delivering and fading assistance. Providing additional cues. So that's, if someone doesn't know how to do a job, it's incumbent upon us. We're the ones that have to provide the information that they need in order to get a correct response. Mark Gold referred to that as external feedback. We're the ones that are externally providing the feedback they need to get the job done. And what he says, if you watch his videos or read his writing, a person has reached independence when they are working from internal feedback. In other words, they're looking at information in the job that tells them what they need to do next, or how they need to do it. So these are the different ways that we can get information to someone. And I actually changed the format of this slide. I used to have it in a linear fashion where it was verbal and then, listed down at the bottom was physical guidance. And what I realized was that by putting it up in that way, I was maybe giving the message that it was some kind of a prompt hierarchy that you had to go through in order to come to the right level of assistance. I don't think there's a universal prompt hierarchy. I think that for each individual learner on whatever type of test they're learning, they're going to have ways of getting information that work better than others. So it's not a universal hierarchy, which is why I don't believe, which is why I put it kind of in a circle, because you're kind of working and have all these options to select, and you're trying to select the correct one based on that person's learning style. So I'm going to start with going in. Well, I'm going to give just a little more information about each one of those areas. I'm going to start with verbal, because my experience is we tend to go to verbal and oftentimes stay there. Lots and lots of words. So this slide kind of speaks for itself. It says, "Can I please be excused? My brain is full." And I have to say, as someone who does a lot of teaching, I totally get that. As a learner, I get it. And also someone who speaks at people, even the most interested people at a certain point, I see people sort of glazing over, and my audience, when I can see them, sometimes looks like that. And it's like, okay, people have had it with the words. They need some processing time. They need, to have some kind of a different learning style used, which is a bit of a struggle in the webinars, trying to fit in different learning styles, because a lot of what I'm doing is talking at you. So again, getting back to, we all get overwhelmed sometimes with verbal. These are some ways that I feel with verbal sometimes, just myself. In situations where I just say, just be quiet, I can't hear myself think. There's too much information, I need some quiet or thinking time. Or how about slow down, just let me catch up. I have to process, just slow it all down. Maybe there's some similarities between how you would respond. And then, or how about, could you repeat that, please? And sometimes we even try to take some more control and we say, could you say it differently? Like, use different words. I'm not getting the words you're using. Or how about, could you just write it down? Like, write it down. I process well. I'll read about it. I'll think about it. Just write it down. Or can you just show me what you mean? Just let's go over to the machine, or let's go over to wherever it is, and can you just show me what you mean? Okay, so that's us sometimes taking charge of our learning and trying to get information learned, delivered in a different style. So what we know about verbal prompting and assistance for some people that we support is that it's really difficult. People who we know have issues with auditory processing that causes delays in processing. We know that's true. We know that for some people, the processing time might be 10 or 20 seconds, which seems like an eternity. Like, we know what we want, we know what we expect, but this person there's 10 or 20 seconds and I'm not seeing movement, or I'm not seeing an indication they understand. For some people, that's processing time. And if we jump in on top of that, it can be confusing. It can cause someone to have to restart, like literally have to think back through the process of getting started. So even if we do use verbal, and I'm someone who sometimes chooses to use a verbal assistance, we want to keep it really brief and specific to the task. It's not a time, if we're in this really one-on-one teaching, there's a lot on the line for the person learning the task, learning their job. It's not a time for a lot of extra conversations. How's the weather? What'd you do last weekend? Christmas is coming. My birthday's coming. You don't want to watch on TV tonight. That's not helpful. And it also, in some cases, it really sets up an expectation that that's what's going to happen when I've got my person here, my one-on-one person. I actually, just recently, I was observing on a job, and the supported employee had someone with her for an extended period of time. She was really being over-supported. But when I came into this situation, she turned around, looked at me, and she said, Are you my person today? And it was just realizing that, you know, she was very capable of doing the job independently, but her social world was really pretty small. And now she's in a situation where she's got a one-on-one person with her, for a period of time. So it just can become very dangerous because we end up being sometimes the most important piece of someone's day, and yet we're expected to leave. So the verbal, go back just a minute because I wanted to mention that Corbin's going to also put up a link. For those of you who have not seen Mark Gold, and I mentioned him last week and again today, there's a link to a video where he's teaching someone to do a bicycle break. And the, the patented strategies that he ended up calling try another way are essentially non-verbal. So if you haven't seen him teaching, and that bicycle break video is a really good demonstration, it's interesting to see if he chooses not to use verbal, what does he need to switch to, and what are the ways of assisting that he uses because he's choosing not to use verbal instruction. So I think that okay. So written visual lists, another way of getting information into someone. If that resonates with folks, then in our teaching, we can tie our cues to those written and visual lists. Caution with visual lists, I know they're very popular and low tech, high tech. We always want to be watching for if that's a method that resonates with someone. For some people, looking at a picture and making the connection between I need to do what this picture says, or this shows me what to do next. For some people, that connection is not made. So just be watching for that. And if you could advance. So what we know about this written and visual supports is that 80% of learners, and this is not separating out people with intellectual developmental disability, but the research shows that about 80% of us, if we had to say, there's a learning style that's strongest for us, we would say, okay, I guess I would have to pick visual. So that's kind of interesting information. And yet what we tend to go to first with our teaching is verbal. Another thing, visual and written lists can remain as self-management tools. So think about this one. Silence is often the most important accommodation for visual learners. And yet what we do sometimes is we talk over someone's learning. They're getting information visually, and we jump in and talk over that, which we find annoying as well. We're trying to process, we're getting information, and someone is layering on top of that. And good news for everyone really is that many employers and businesses are moving to more visual systems. Okay. So click. Thank you. Modeling is another way of getting information to someone. And that's a very common way of teaching, whether someone has an intellectual or developmental disability or non. If you could click to the next slide. Whoops, back one. So modeling, can be showing how, either single steps or a whole task. And someone says, well, what, one or the other? And it totally depends on your learner. The big machine that I showed last week, the mailing one that had all those steps, some people that I've worked with their attention would be held and they would be focused throughout the entire task. I might model and teach the entire task. Other people, based on their learning style, I may choose to just show a small part of the job and kind of focusing on teaching that and then build on the rest of the task. Another approach is actually doing it at the same time, doing it together, working side by side if a task lends itself to that. You always want to be thinking about dominant hand. And so I'm right hand dominant. One of the things that I'm always watching for if I'm doing really close teaching with someone is establishing what seems to be their dominant hand, so that I'm not unintentionally teaching them to use their non-dominant hand. I always avoid teaching or modeling from the front for a couple of reasons. One, it pulls people off task. I'm right in front of you, an easy target. Another reason is that it can be really confusing to follow if someone's teaching you how to do something from in front of you. You're having to kind of translate that to how you need to do the task. So another way of getting information through to people is visual prompts, gestures, actually showing the information that's needed. For some people, that's really helpful, and you can see them reading your body language, your information. But for other people, using visual prompts and gestures just isn't very helpful. So recognizing, yeah, that's a choice. I could use this in teaching, but it may or may not be helpful. Next slide. So one of the other options for getting information through to someone is actually to use physical guidance, giving information through touch. And I have to say that again, if you move to the next slide, Corbin. Whoops, one behind. There we go. Physical guidance. Some people refer to it as hand over hand, manual feedback, all different ways of kind of describing giving information through touch. This is another area when there's an opportunity for discussion from the audience. It's oftentimes a lively discussion. If you reference the gold video without words, you can see the amount of information he ended up sharing through touch. So be thinking of that if you choose to look at that video. On more than one occasion when I've talked about physical guidance, the response from the audience is, well, that seems like it could be useful, but we're not allowed to do that. And my next question is, not allowed to do what? And the response typically is, we're not allowed to touch people. Unfortunately, what has happened is that some people misunderstand physical guidance to be forced compliance, and that is not what we're talking about. Forced compliance is not okay. Physical guidance for the purpose of teaching is different, and so sometimes the discussion needs to be just an understanding about what we're actually talking about. Many states, mine included, other states that I've been to, have put in place some necessary policies to protect people, and in terms of how they're interacted with by staff, and that whole area of forced compliance, which is something that unfortunately was used a number of years ago and was used without permission. And was used without oversight, is still with us, and with some who don't understand that we're not talking about forced compliance. At any rate, that oftentimes is a time for discussion. But physical guidance, hand over hand, manual feedback, maybe I choose to use that with a learner. What I always keep in mind is that for some people, touch is distracting and uncomfortable for some people. So just being touched is distracting, uncomfortable for any number of reasons. For other people, you want to recognize that touch is really comfortable and reinforcing to some individuals. So if you fall into a pattern of constantly using touch to teach, and someone finds that very comforting and reinforcing, you may have a hard time fading. Physical guidance, another thing to keep in mind, can range from full physical guidance, where literally you've got your hands over someone's hands and you're giving them information about how to use their hands or fingers, to a very light touch, which might be a touch on the shoulder or a touch on the wrist or touch in some way, giving information. So in my world, all of that is physical guidance, but there's a range, or a continuum, I guess you could say. And recognizing, as I've stated already, is that physical guidance should never be used to force movement or compliance. That's a lose-lose situation, and we just don't do that in teaching. But my concern when I go into those settings where people say, well, it doesn't really matter because we can't use it, is that as a teacher or a trainer, and that has been taken off the table. You can't use this one particular way of giving information to someone. Our teaching then is compromised, I think. If we recognize that it would be really helpful to someone's learning style and we're not able to do that, our teaching is compromised and their learning is compromised. So what I have people, especially in instructional situations, think about in terms of touch is that there needs to be some language that says under these situations, if we believe it's going to be the most helpful form of assistance, if it's tolerated by the learner, if it's ended as soon as the learner indicates that there's any discomfort with it, if it's faded as soon as possible. I mean, with all of those qualifiers, I think that physical guidance, needs to be one of the decisions that we can make in terms of our support to someone. So I've gone through all the various strategies that we can pull from in terms of getting information into someone. What I think is at the real crux of being a good instructor, a good trainer, is making the right decisions around what do I pick, how much do I use, and when do I use it. So when you click on this, you can bring up the next visual, just clicking on that slide, Corbin. There we go. What I tell people is you won't find that answer. You won't find it in that red book, that antique that I showed you, although that's good content there. But you won't find the answer there. You won't find it in this webinar. You'll find it in your learner. You take your cue from the learner. Their learning style will guide you in what you should be using, when you should be using it, how much you should be using, when you should be fading. You're always taking your information from the learner's performance. When you're providing that assistance, never any more than the minimum to get a correct response. And if you think back to the Michael Labeler video where he was doing the job and you could see me, should I step in, should I pull back? I mean, I was trying to make the right decision in order to give him the maximum of time to get it right, but I wanted to avoid him making a mistake and therefore maybe, being confused about how it's actually done. So I always think about myself when I'm doing this, systematic instruction or tight teaching, I call it sometimes. You're just right on the edge about whether you give that information or whether you hold back. Over prompting, I mentioned several times before, will lead to cue dependence for many people. You need to allow people time to process. You anticipate and avoid errors in the early stages of learning so that what you're wanting the learner to get is understanding the consistent, predictable pattern and not having a lot of errors in there that have to be undone or backed up creates confusion. And it's true for ourselves as well. If we're really struggling to learn something, our best shot at learning it quickly and independently is if we don't have to unlearn errors, if we don't get confused about trial and error sort of learning. There can be a place for that, but not if someone has a lot of confusion around the task. You always tie your assistance to cues in the task. In setting up the AV equipment. So if you could flip to the next, Corbin. So when I watch folks teaching sometimes, and I see it when I do teaching sometimes, I think, oh my gosh, I'm not doing anything differently, and yet I'm expecting this person, their performance to change. So insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that is what I observe sometimes when people want feedback on their teaching is that, whoa, you need to pull from some other strategies to get to this person's learning style. Next slide. Knowing when and how to fade. Whether I said it or not, to this audience, I typically start fading from the very first time I go through a task with someone or an activity with someone. I start my fading at that point. There's fading from the job site, and people talk about that as being, well, we're projecting 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 2 months. There's fading from the site, but you have to also be fading from the individual tasks. from day one, making good decisions about when and how to fade. Hingsberger, again, the most important tool for teaching is the willingness to evaluate what you're doing on a moment by moment basis. Which a point I want to make about that is some of you maybe are transitioning from or have transitioned from settings where you're working with a larger group of people, maybe 5 people on a crew or 15 people in a workshop where you're responsible for their production and independence. When you're in that situation, sometimes people say, well, how this is really useful information, but how does this work when you've got 5 other people you're responsible for or 15 people you're responsible for? And my answer is it doesn't work very well. That's why moving toward supported employment, individual jobs, lends itself to being able to focus on a specific individual's learning style and their challenges in learning a task so that we can respond on that moment by moment basis in their learning. I've worked in settings where there have been larger numbers of people. I've worked in those settings having this knowledge, and it's really frustrating because you really aren't able to give an individual the focus they might need if it's a task that they truly don't know how to do. So in fading, you're always transferring your control to the cues in the task. You're making sure that you tie the cues to the task and not to you, so that the person doesn't become dependent on you to give them information on how to get through a task or a day. You're shifting from external to internal feedback. And those are words of Mark Gold, but they make sense to me as well. You're moving away from the learner. It's another way of indicating that you're fading back, even if it's a few steps back. And I try to always do my teaching from the side or behind, because I don't want to be easily accessible if they don't need me. I don't want to be an easy target, and I want their focus to be on the task. You're waiting just a little bit longer before you deliver those prompts. If you could switch to the next slide. Thank you. So when an error does occur, I will take a different approach depending on whether I believe someone's early in their learning or someone is late in their learning, the late stage of learning, I guess. And the way I think of that is when someone's early in their learning, they are not chaining those steps together. They're indicating a lot of confusion about what to do next and how does this task go. That may be someone in the morning. By the afternoon, they may be chaining those steps together, and a lot of learning has taken place, and there's very little need for you to step in and either correct or give information. So someone can be in early learning in the morning, late learning in the afternoon. Or someone might be in early learning on particular tasks within a job for a week or two, or maybe longer. And other tasks within that job, perhaps they've got it down. So the way I respond to when an error is made differs. When someone is early in learning, I typically interrupt as soon as possible. I prevent the error if I can, just step in and prevent the error from happening. If the error's been made, I interrupt as soon as possible. Doesn't have to be punishing. It shouldn't be punishing. Just neutral, non-punishment, wait, back, whoa. And then take the person, give them the information they need to do it correctly, and then support them to get through that step or series of steps correctly. When an error occurs late in someone's learning, and by definition, again, I'm looking at someone who's chaining together steps, I'm fading back, I'm not having to be as close in proximity, and yet I see an error happening, about to happen. In some cases in that scenario, I would let the error happen. If I believe that it's not going to be job loss time or damaging property time, because the consequence of making that error for some people, you learn from that. It's like, oh, I didn't get all my supplies. I've got to go all the way back to get them. Or, oh, I left this step out of the task and therefore I can't complete the task. So I've got to go back and, correct. So there can be a value to experiencing the consequence. Another thing that I might do is stop the learner with just a little bit of information to see if they self-correct. Things like, what comes next, or is that next, or what did you forget? those kinds of it just draws people attention to the task. What you can watch for then is, do they focus? Do they kind of have that aha moment and move on? So it gives you really important information to say, actually, they were just distracted. They just didn't see that step. We do the same thing when we know how to do a task sometimes. As we get distracted, we're thinking about something else. We look back to the task or to whatever we were working on, and it's like there's something within it that tells us we need to fix it. That's what you're watching for, that kind of reaction. What I do tell people is that if you're working with someone who's early in their learning, so they've already shown you that they are really not certain of the order or the things that come next, avoid using those late learning strategies. So avoid asking someone early in their learning, well, what did you forget? Or does that look right? Or what comes next? That really isn't very helpful. And it doesn't give the person information. So early in learning, I don't use those strategies. What I like to use, because most people have experienced it, is in our lives when, say, for example, we can't find the keys, and someone has the poor judgment to say, well, can you just remember where you left them, or where's the last place you had them? Not recognizing how anxious we are in that moment, and we can't even retrieve that useful information because we're so anxious about the fact that we can't find our keys. Not very helpful in the moment. So try to keep that in mind, that avoid asking those questions early in teaching. It's just confusing and frustrating, and think about the whole key scenario. So you want to advance for me, Corbin? So another thing in terms of fading, as a learner's gaining independence, so they are kind of in later learning. They're not needing a lot of support from me in terms of how to do the task. I faded back on my reinforcement for the task. I do something that's really very technical at that point. I try to figure out what could possibly happen to screw this up. So that's very technical language. Screw this up, and then I make it happen. So what I'm trying to do at that point is I'm trying to test how solid the understanding is. What tends to happen if we're the ones doing the teaching sometimes is just by virtue of being there, we've sort of managed some of those variables. The person doesn't get interrupted as much. We're kind of looking ahead to see if the parts they need might be damaged, or they might run out of something. They might run out of their work task, like what they should do next. So without really meaning to, a lot of times we end up sort of managing those variables. And what I'm wanting to see before I fade completely out of a site is realizing how I hate to block out the sunshine in Seattle, but I'm going to. Almost. At any rate, what I'm looking for is what's their reaction to these kinds of things happening. That will let me know whether I need to teach those variables. So I've got some more teaching to do before I can fade. So next slide. Wrapping up, and I realized that there's been very little time for discussion or interaction, but my hope is that there's still value in getting this overview of information. I know when I was introduced for it the first time, it was a 1-hour conference lecture on systematic instruction, and it certainly didn't give me everything I ultimately learned and continue to learn, but what it did was it kind of illustrated what I need to know. Like, this is something I need to know more about. It got my awareness up and my interest up. So a few reminders when we're out there teaching is you're always looking for the need to maybe be teaching some of the social skills. And I know the focus of this teaching has been on task related, but there's sometimes a need to teach social skills. This one, if you think about it, because didn't see it coming, that whole I need to appear busy anyway, I need to be focused. Most of us learned that in kindergarten. It's like, oh, teacher's coming, gonna get that crayon really moving here because she needs to see that I'm working. So a little simplistic, but again, some people haven't had the opportunity to learn social skills or to understand the expectation in particular settings for social skills. Some not as important as other settings. Next slide. Ah, um, think back to that motivation to learn when you're not making progress sometimes in your teaching. You can go back to task design and task analysis and tightening up your teaching. But another thing to, to always consider is their motivation to learn? Like, what is this person's incentive to show up, to work on this task, to do this job? And it's just a silly cartoon that is very true in our household. We have one room that's totally devoted to music equipment, high tech equipment, high definition, everything, audio, but I can't operate any of it. And my husband keeps trying to teach me. And what he doesn't understand is that I don't care. I have absolutely no incentive to learn. And so I have to kind of pretend that it's just overwhelming. I think I'm going to get hurt. I do everything I can to discourage that teaching behavior because I don't care. Okay. Next slide. And another question to ask, and I realize how precious finding those jobs can be, but boy, the preventative value of making the best possible job match, it's reasonable to expect there's going to be, and there should actually be, some kind of a gap between the person going into this job and what they might need to do all of it. That happens with us as well. We go into a job, some of it we know, some of it we have to learn. But unfortunately, when I see some gaps between everything this person is going to have to learn and everything we either know or are learning about this person in terms of good job match, the gap sometimes can be huge. So, the value of a reasonable job match. Next slide. Okay, so you have 6 minutes um, to comment. I guess one way of thinking about it would be both last week and this week. In hearing this information, what's your biggest takeaway? What are some things that you either might change how you do or start doing? What's your biggest takeaway from the content? I'm gonna wait a few minutes. Corbin, there's buttons I could be touching, but I have not wanted to do that because I'm afraid I'll close out the whole session. So I really appreciate the fact that you stepped in and have been moving things
No
around
problem. I
for me.
apologize. It wasn't working for
No. I think it's that whole anxiety thing. It's like I believe I've got two different screens open, but I'm afraid if I click off one that I'll have trouble getting it back. So I just decided to not touch. Okay, so in the meantime, maybe you can keep track of questions as they come up. If you'll put the next slide, there are a few resources. There have been some articles, not a lot of books specific to systematic construction. That antique red book that I held up, still great stuff. The language in it is pretty overwhelming. It's research oriented, and so I sometimes wonder if people were paid by the letter, the words that they used in that. But it's great content. It's really what I continue to teach from is the principles in that red book. Um, a more recent book is by Keith Story, Systematic Construction for Students and Adults with Disabilities. Great book. Keith Story was a PhD student under Tom Bellamy, one of the authors of the Red Book. So when I read this second book, I was looking for consistency, and it was definitely there. Fascinating book is Mark Gold's book, Did I Say That? Based on articles and commentary on the Try Another Way system. So in 1980, he kind of looked back to some of the articles he'd written and so on. And this book is just summarizing some of his commentary. You read the article and then he kind of chimes in on that. Social coaching, James Emmett. There's a number of people who talk about this, but this is a great resource for you. So just wanted to kind of cover some of those resources. And last slide. That's my alarm system that went off, also known as PEEPS. This is me, my email, my phone number. And if we don't get to specific questions, or a week from now you wonder about certain things, I'm happy to respond. So, what's happening?
Looks like we have a few people just talking about some things that they learned that they appreciated from the training.
Hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah, being reminded of that learning. So one thing that's happening is that, oh, wait a minute. Phew, okay, I managed to do that. So now I can see the comments. Individual, yeah, needs of each client. I mean, in a perfect world, schools included, we would always be teaching to the learning style, the best possible way for someone to learn something. And for myself, I have different learning styles depending on what I have to learn. If I'm working on the computer, I prefer something written. If I'm working on something mechanical, I want you to show me how to do it. I want my hands on it. So it even depends on what task I'm learning, which learning strategy is going to be best for me. Give time for the client to process. Right. Yeah, that processing time of just waiting for either the words or whatever information you've given, waiting for time for that to sink in. And looks like some questions about being able to access the webinars, which brings us to 11:30. You might have a few wrap-up comments,
Well, I
Corbin.
just wanted to say thank you, Terry, for all the content and training that you provided us. I don't know if you have any final last words, but before I turn that time back over to you, just to wrap things up, I wanted to let you know, all the participants know that we'll provide a certificate. I'll provide a file you can download here in just a second, and I'll provide also the slides that you can download. But again, thank you, Terry. This has been very informative and great instruction. And if there's anything else you want to add, then I'll let you do that. And people are ready, they're free to go after Terry's done. Thank you.
No, well, I guess I am adding a comment. So yes, I feel like many of you came into this with teaching skills, right? But if you're like me, I'm always open to adding on. I go to other people presenting systematic instruction. I'm always looking for information that can help me to be a more effective teacher or trainer. So I just encourage that approach. I'm glad people found it valuable.